Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's 6 o'clock and it's time to start our first Thursday of the month free webinar series for school board members. Tonight's theme or topic is education in the 2019 legislative session. I am joined, well, let me just see if I can advance. So I'm Nicole Mace, the Executive Director of the Vermont School Boards Association, and with me tonight is Sue Suglowski, our Director of Legal and Policy Services. I'll let Sue say hi.
Hello, everyone.
And Carrie Lamb, our Director of Operations.
Hello, I'm here.
So if any of you experience any difficulties during the course of the webinar, please feel free to contact us at the office, and Carrie will troubleshoot with you. Some other logistics for the webinar: it is a PowerPoint presentation. Sue and I will be doing most of the presenting. You have a question box along the side of your window there to enter questions that you have for us. You're always welcome to enter those questions. We may not be able to answer you tonight, but we always provide written responses to unanswered questions in a follow-up communication to folks that register for the webinar. You'll also receive an evaluation form when you exit the webinar. Please be sure to complete that. Just takes a couple of minutes. And then you will, those who register for tonight's webinar, receive an email follow-up with a summary, video, and the PowerPoint slides. We also have another handout that we'll be sharing with you as part of that resource document. And then we also archive all these webinars on our website and on the VSBA YouTube channel, so you can access them anytime. Board members on your board that haven't been able to register for tonight's webinar can access them that way. So tonight's agenda, we're going to, for those of you who may be new to Vermont's legislative process, we're going to do a pretty brief overview of that process. We'll then turn to an overview of the political environment in 2019, refresh your memory on VSBA resolutions, which really guide our advocacy within the State House. And give you some tips about how you, as a school board member and as your school board, can act as advocates in the 2019 legislative session. So I think now I'm going to turn it over to Sue.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm going to start with an overview of the legislative process and give you some background information on the General Assembly. The House has 150 representatives, the Senate has 30 senators, and they serve for 2-year terms. The General Assembly convenes in January for a biennial term, and this typically adjourns in May, and right now we are starting the first year of a new biennium. The staff of the General Assembly is the Legislative Council and the Joint Fiscal Office. And the committees that typically are considering legislation that would be of interest are the Education Committee, the Appropriations Committee, Finance, Ways and Means, Institutions, Government Operations, and Health and Welfare. We have a list of legislators by SU and SD on the VSBA website, and we also provide you with a link to the that list when we send out our legislative report, which I will talk about a little bit later.
Sue, I'm going to jump in and just make a note that Vermont is relatively unique in terms of the fact that we have 2-year terms for not just our House and Senate members, but also statewide offices. Not many states have 2-year terms, and we're also unique in terms of the staffing that's available to legislators. So this line about limiting to Legislative Council and the Joint Fiscal Office, that means that legislators really rely on other sources for information, insights, and analysis when they're considering legislation, in addition to their professional staff. Sorry.
No, thank you. So on to the next slide, which is an overview of the legislative process. This process begins in a couple different ways. We start out with the governor sharing priorities in the state of the state and budget address, and also with legislators submitting their own bills for consideration by committees of jurisdiction. And the committees consider these bills and also develop their own pieces of legislation. If the House or the Senate passes a bill, then it is sent over to the other body for consideration. If the House and Senate versions of legislation differ, and they haven't agreed, then a conference committee is appointed where the two sides negotiate a final version of the bill. And the conference committee consists of 3 members from each chamber, and they're attempting to reach agreement on a final version. If the same version of a bill is approved by both bodies, then it goes to the governor, and if the governor signs the bill, it becomes law. The bill also can become law without the governor's signature. If the governor vetoes a bill, then the General Assembly can override the veto with a 2/3 majority, which means 100 votes in the House and 20 votes in the Senate. Are there any questions on the legislative process?
We will also, in addition to the slides that we put together here, we have a 1-page resource from the Vermont General Assembly that talks about the legislative process. It's a nice graphic illustration and a 1-page that we will be including in the email that you receive, which gets into a little bit more detail. Carrie,
Yes,
does anybody have any questions?
Not at this time. No one has typed in any questions yet.
Okay. If something occurs to you later, feel free to type that in. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes on the 2019 political environment. Governor Phil Scott was elected to a second term as governor pretty handily. But the major shift in the dynamic is that Democrats in the General Assembly now hold a veto-proof majority. Many of you will recall that the last 2 legislative sessions have ended with a veto of the budget on tax bills over education funding primarily. And the Democrats were unable to override those vetoes because they did not hold the 2/3 majority, and they were unable to bring House members, primarily House members from the Republican side along with a veto override vote. So now that they have that veto-proof majority, it's not a guarantee that they'll be able to override a veto, but it definitely changes the dynamic somewhat. We'll also see new leadership of the House Education Committee. An announcement has not been made yet as to who that will be, but Representative Dave Sharp, who was the chair for the last 4 years, resigned, or didn't run for another term. So we know for sure there will be a new chair of the House Education Committee. There's also new revenue to the Education Fund due to e-commerce taxes. So last year, the final budget included some changes to the revenue to the Education Fund. The general fund transfer to the Education Fund was eliminated in lieu of 100% of sales and use tax. And then in basically the same week of the final week of the legislative session, there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision that ruled that states could collect taxes on e-commerce from entities such as Amazon and Wayfair. And so because of that, there's been additional revenue to the Education Fund that we haven't seen in terms of sales and use tax in previous years. There is, sort of, as always, a multitude of special interests that are proposing legislation affecting education. That's a sort of an annual dynamic that we contend with, in addition to signals that education governance and finance will be ongoing issues of interest. The only real hard piece of information we have is the December 1 Tax Commissioner's letter, which this year predicts that for FY20, average homestead tax rates and non-residential rates will be level. And that's due to a number of factors. It assumes 3.24% growth in education spending. It relies on $21 million in one-time money through undesignated reserve funds. So anticipated surplus funds for FY19 being used to balance the ed fund in FY20. This would mean 3 consecutive years of heavy reliance on one-time money to fund ongoing operational expenses. It also, one of the reasons that in addition to use of one-time money, that they're predicting level tax rates is because there's been growth in the grant list, and there's also been growth in the revenue to the ed fund through new e-commerce. The December 1 letter proposes to direct $6.6 million of that new e-commerce revenue to early care and education, although it's not clear how that money would be allocated and to whom. The letter also goes on to say that if education spending growth is kept at FY19 levels, which was 1.7%, school boards and administrators did an incredible job of keeping education spending growth much lower than anticipated last year. So if that is replicated this year, an additional $21 million could be saved to lower property taxes or invest in early education, or both. So that is really the only signal we've seen out of the administration in terms of education funding, at least, as we're headed into the session, which begins next week. We should say that. The first day of the session is on January 9th. So here are a list of, because we don't have any, we don't have a chair of a House Education Committee, and there's not been a lot of formal statements made by either the administration or House or Senate leadership in terms of their priorities around policy issues impacting education. Here's a list of issues that we are aware of that are either coming out of work groups that were established by the legislature or sort of external advocates, or just the practical realities of certain issues needing to be addressed, such as lead testing in schools. There was a pilot program that revealed that some schools that participated in the project had elevated lead levels, and so there's a serious effort to move towards requiring school districts to or schools to test all the water sources for lead. Pension funding has been a perennial issue. Last year, the General Assembly and Governor were divided over whether or not to allocate substantial amounts of one-time money to buy down pension obligations. They sort of split the difference, but it's clear that our unfunded pension liabilities are continuing to be an issue that policymakers want to address. There was a task force created in Act 11 last year, creating on staff-to-student ratios. That report is expected to come out shortly, I believe mid-January. That group, which we were a member of, is not likely to recommend we're not going to recommend target ratios. There simply was not sufficient time in order to even dig into that. But what we were able to do was come to an agreement on some definitions of what should be counted as staff. We looked at different types of ratios, including administrator-to-student ratio, general education teacher-to-student ratio, special ed student-to-teacher ratio, support staff-to-student ratio, et cetera, which are consistent with federal definitions. So that report is likely to generate more interest in the staff-student ratio conversation but we'll do anything other than inform the conversation with clearer definitions and data. Act 173 implementation, there's a task force, again, a working group that is expected to produce a report in mid-January as well, with some recommendations to the General Assembly for any statutory changes necessary to implement that act. The group meets next week to finalize the report's recommendations. Among the issues we will need to discuss is how to align the funding requirements for independent schools that accept public dollars with the requirements for public schools. So expect that to be a focused discussion next week, and hopefully resulting in a clear recommendation. There's been a fair amount of discussion around Act 166, which is our universal pre-K law, over the past several years. Different attempts have been made to make adjustments to the law as issues with implementation have been identified. Our association has raised concerns about equity and efficiency in terms of the program design itself, and then also concerns about joint agency regulation and dual oversight of the program well to date. So we expect continued conversation around how to improve Act 166. The new Secretary of Education has also identified that as a priority of his. Some legislators are also expressing an interest in making some adjustments to Act 46. That law at this point has been fully implemented, and there have been at least 2 lawsuits filed, so it's unclear as to what course the Act 46 conversation will take, but it is likely to be an area of focus for the House Education Committee and the Senate Education Committee in the beginning of the session. State aid for capital construction has not been available to school districts for more than a decade, and the effects of that are definitely being felt around the state. And so there's a group of us that are working together to make the call for a reinstatement of the capital construction aid program. Don't have a lot of details on that, but it's definitely an issue that a lot of folks are interested in and paying attention to. And then finally, there was a section of the miscellaneous ed bill last year that would have created a task force to study Vermont standards and curriculum to make sure that they are reflective of all cultures and perspectives. It's known as the Ethnic Studies Bill that got put into the miscellaneous education bill. We know that there's continued interest in focusing on that issue, and expect that that will be reintroduced this session. So those are, and the graphic in the center of that slide is really, I think, illustrative of what happens to us when we get into the State House in terms of these issues tend to pull us in a lot of different directions, and they tend to cross multiple committees. So it's, in addition to just being a nice little image, it, I think, is illustrative of the experience we have managing and monitoring all these issues. And these are just the ones that we know about. Any questions about the policy environment in 2019?
You answered the one question that came up, Nicole, so you're good.
Oh, look at that. Okay, so we'll move on. Oh, looks like there might be another question.
Yes. How do these issues coincide with what VSBA wants to do?
Well, that's a nice segue into our discussion about the VSBA resolutions. But what I would say is, let me just go back, sorry. So I think we have an interest in ensuring any issue that impacts education is informed by the perspectives of our members. And to the extent we have resolutions that speak directly to these issues, we will follow our resolution. To the extent that the issue is new or not addressed by our resolutions, the approach we take is to gather information that is relevant in terms of any reports or experts on the topic that can meet with the VSBA Board of Directors and help inform the issues and sort of, generally how this may affect school districts and public education. And then the board deliberates and provides me with some direction, or Sue with some direction. And, and we try to navigate the policy environment, which is incredibly dynamic and which we do not control, the best we can in terms of making sure that we're at the table, we understand the issues, the board understands the issues, and we're weighing in as appropriate along the way. So
Okay.
I will now... Well, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Nicole. We have 2 more questions.
Oh, good.
Jeannie Jensen wants to know about the Health Insurance Task Force.
So the bargaining commission has been appointed. We do not expect that is going to result in any legislative activity, but both sides have appointed their representatives. The 5 members that were appointed by the VSBA board have met once, and they're meeting again next week to start to, do the work of preparing to negotiate. Negotiations have to begin by April 1st. We have the NEA and the VSBA have collaborated on a data request to all school business managers and superintendents to obtain the data that the parties believe we need in order to inform the negotiations. And so I do not expect, and I've confirmed this with the NEA, do not expect that this is going to be a subject of legislative discussion. However, I do know that the NEA has expressed an interest in legislation that would regulate third-party providers such as future planning associates. And I've asked to see that bill to the extent they have any language once they have it. So that's an area where we don't have a resolution on that. It's a new issue for our organization. We would want to do our due diligence on the topic to determine whether or not we would support that type of legislation. But other than that, my expectation is the process was created in Act 11, and it's going to play itself out this spring, summer, and fall.
Wonderful. I have one more question from Mark.
Okay. Okay.
It says there was also supposed to be a study on equalized pupil weighting, e.g.
Yes.
EL and FRL weights. Will that be happening in the coming year?
That will be happening in the coming year. My understanding is that the Agency of Education has signed, had put out an RFP, and I believe the University of Vermont was awarded the contract. So I think the deadline for that study is, and Sue, correct me if I have this wrong, but I think it's next fall. So it's not going to be revealed, the results, during this legislative session. Because it's a complex topic, they gave at least a year for the study to be concluded. But that progress has been made in that a bid was accepted to do the work, which is great news. Is that it for now?
That is it.
Again, we still have time, so feel free to ask questions. So I'm going to say a few words about our resolutions process before I speak to the specific resolutions. So according to our bylaws, any school board can submit a resolution to the membership for consideration at the annual meeting. The VSBA board also appoints a committee, and that committee reviews resolutions that were submitted by member boards, but it also can develop their own resolutions to put to the membership for consideration. If a board submits a resolution to the VSBA, irrespective of what the committee recommends, that resolution will go to the floor of the annual meeting. If the committee makes a recommendation and the VSBA board doesn't agree, then it does not move forward to the membership. So I'm going to share with you some applicable resolutions. We do not eliminate or start from scratch every year. So we have many resolutions that have been part of our handbook for several years. Not all of them are applicable in any given year, but I've done my best to identify ones that I think are likely to be applicable. And this is really just to inform folks about how we will be approaching issues as they come up. So we'll start with 3 new resolutions this year. The first 2 relate to cost containment, and they really are consistent with messages that we've been delivering in the General Assembly, but it's always good to have it in resolutions form because then I have the weight of the membership behind us. But the first one is essentially that the General Assembly has to allow reasonable time for school districts to plan for cost containment and not pass legislation that affects budgets already adopted. So many of you will remember that in the past 2 years, there's been, first year I think both years, the clawback happened 2 years in a row. The legislature approved action as part of their negotiations with the governor that withheld funds from school districts after budgets were already approved, and that is something that we have continued to convey is totally unacceptable. But we have a new resolution this year that makes that crystal clear. And on a related note, to the extent the legislature is going to go down the path of establishing ratio targets, which again, given the task force's inability to focus on what might possibly be appropriate target ratios, I think it's unlikely that they will go down that road. But to the extent they do, that we want them to take into consideration the costs associated with provided social services when both making funding decisions, but also in establishing any ratio targets for school districts. And another new resolution this year really is intended to respond to some of the changes in supervisory union board structure and the laws that have every member school district that operates a school appoints 3 members to the SU board. Well, now that we've seen a significant number of districts consolidate, you have some supervisory unions that have districts that are much larger than others, but who have seen their representation on the SU board decline substantially because they're down to only 3 votes. So we don't have a specific proposal at this point. We have had some conversations with folks at the Agency of Education and the Superintendents Association to try to think through what some possibilities might be for ensuring that SU board structure and composition takes into account issues of fairness, equity, and funding. This resolution is a really important resolution. It was adopted by the members in 2014, and it actually replaced the long-standing resolution that the organization had opposing mandatory consolidation. So it acknowledges that as an organization, we support initiatives that are designed to create greater equity and high quality learning opportunities and to achieve cost effectiveness, but that any initiative that impacts our governance structure or funding system must be designed in a way that reflects our community values, and that school boards are in the best position to inform that process and must be fully engaged. So this is really our message when it comes to making changes to funding or governance. You have to have school boards at the table, and those changes have to result in greater equity and in high quality learning opportunities. Some other resolutions, I'm not going to read through or go into great detail, all of them, but to the earlier question around equalization and that study, this is a resolution that we've used to support that, in addition to, I believe, another one we have directly calling for a study of the weights. But that we need to ensure significant state expenditure in order to equalize the financial resources of districts and maintain educational opportunities for students. The more we have to rely on the property tax to fund education, the more we will continue to see disparities between communities of means and communities without. Despite the fact that we have an equal funding system or an equitable funding system, there are still differences in the amount that communities are willing to spend per student. And that becomes exacerbated when you become more reliant on the property tax to fund education rather than more a mix of funding sources for our education system. And that again relates to the second point. We are open to an examination of other funding sources for the education fund rather than continuing a system that predominantly relies on the property tax for the reasons I just articulated. We oppose diversion of ed fund resources to programs not within the jurisdiction of public school districts or supervisory unions. This is one reason we are concerned about the December 1 letter proposing to divert $6.6 million in new ed fund revenue to early care and education programs. It's not clear that those programs would be within the jurisdiction of public school districts. So that is going to be our message as we have conversations with policymakers, that if we want to invest in early care and education, we support that goal, but those investments, if they're going to be made through the education fund, need to be made within with the oversight and accountability provided by publicly elected school boards. We also oppose unfunded mandates. So to the extent there's a new educational requirement or program, lead testing, for example, of all schools, that's an absolutely appropriate interest of the state of Vermont, and we ought to be working collaboratively to make that happen, but those costs should be borne by the state if it is indeed a state priority and a state requirement. Any questions there? And again, that's not by any stretch the entire landscape of VSBA resolutions, but given the issues that we see on the horizon, they are among the more relevant. But I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have about those or any other resolutions, which are on our website. I thought I saw a question, but then it went away.
Yes, the question was just about being able to hear you properly. Is everyone able to hear? Is everyone able to hear? If you're able to hear what we're saying, can you put your hands up?
There should be a hand icon. There they are.
There's a little hand icon to put up. Yes, I'm seeing many hands go up. So thank you very much.
Okay, good. So is there a question, though? I also see a little question mark there. And if you at any point have questions about what's happening in the State House or what the VSBA position is, feel free to send me an email or Sue an email. We have our contact information at the end of this presentation. But certainly a message that we always convey, particularly when we know that there's diverging opinions in the state on a particular topic, which is not unusual because the context for school boards differs so much around the state. It's rare that our members are unanimous on any given issue, and we reflect that to policymakers. So when we know, members are split on this, but we have a resolution and it points us in this direction, we make that clear. We could never walk into that building and with a straight face purport to represent every school board member in the state of Vermont. And so we welcome you keeping in touch with us and asking us questions and providing us with your perspectives, because that makes our testimony and our conversations with legislators all the more meaningful.
Okay, I have a question.
I knew if I talked long enough.
This is from Linda. She said, in regards to resolutions, and there's another one. She said, in regards to resolutions about representation, will there be a committee to form what the VSBA wants to say?
I guess I'm going to need you to clarify that question. When you say representation, a committee on representation, I'm not quite sure what that means. Any clarification would be great.
Okay, and while we're waiting for the clarification from Linda, Alice said, this is very informative as usual. Thanks for all you guys are doing.
Oh, thanks.
Linda
Thank you,
said,
Alice.
Linda said, how many people on the SU boards?
On that specific topic. So that varies widely depending on the supervisory union. So if you're a supervisory union with 3 districts, and all 3 districts operate a school, that is, they don't pay tuition for all grades, then you would have a 9-member supervisory union board. There are some supervisory unions with 7 districts, some of which operate schools, some which don't, in which case you'd have a higher number of board members. And so I think what we're looking at is, at this point, the only way you can have a different SU board configuration is if the SU board itself submits a request to the State Board of Education for a waiver. And there are some places where that has been agreed to and has happened, and the State Board has granted representation that looks somewhat more proportional, although not directly proportional. There are some SUs, however, that if the board members do not hold the majority, even though they have the majority of the students in the SU, and they're unable to convince the other SU board members to petition the state board for a waiver, there's no process for appeal or review by the state board. And so one consideration that we have discussed is, could there be some sort of requirement for state board review of SU board composition if there's substantial disproportionality that results after a merger. And again, the VSBA board, which is comprised of 2 school board members from each of 11 regions in the state of Vermont, a president and a past president. So we've got 24 school board members that represent the entire state. That board would be the place where we would go to vet a specific recommendation. So it's unlikely we would form a committee to do that. We would bring the recommendation to the board. And we're going to do that in either January or February.
Okay, I have a couple more statements from Linda. She said, our SU has a district with many more students and only 3 reps. We have asked the SU and they say no. She said, will the VSBA form a committee to look at this, which I think you just answered while she was typing. How will the VSBA look at this resolution?
Right. So we are in active conversations with attorneys from the Agency of Education because they're also engaged in a review of Title 16, sort of post Act 46. What makes, what modifications need to be made to state statute in order to reflect the new reality in terms of governance, and that's both in the Unified Union School District statutes and the Supervisory Union statutes. So we've been in active conversations. I'm in the process of refining what a proposal could look like, and then I bring it to the board. The board will review it and give me feedback, guidance, and then if we receive the board's approval, then we put it into play with the legislature. It may be, though, that the Agency of Education also brings it forward as an issue because they have agreed that it is problematic. I hope that answered the question.
And I think that's
Anything else? Okay, so now I'll hand it back over to Sue.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to talk a little bit about school boards and school board members as advocates in 2019 and give you some information that will help you be an advocate. One of the first points that is important is establishing a relationship with your legislators. And as I mentioned earlier, we have on our website and also as a link in our legislative reports, a list of your legislators by SU or SD so that you can easily locate them. School board members should be a credible source of information on education issues that impact your community, and your messages to your legislators should emphasize the effect on the students and not on you as a board. When you are presenting information to legislators, it's important to present your point of view to them in language that is understandable, and also because there are often many last-minute changes that a bill undergoes. There's often many different versions of a bill. When possible, it's helpful if you can support your positions and principles rather than specific legislation. So think about the points that you want to make that would be applicable in a broader context. The VSBA has many resources to support your advocacy, and some of them are listed here on your screen. One of the most important ones is our legislative report, which goes out regularly during the legislative session. And this report is a collaboration of the Vermont Education Legislative Collaborative. The members of that collaborative are the Vermont School Boards Association, the Vermont Superintendents Association, the Vermont Principals Association, Vermont School Boards Insurance Trust, the Vermont Council of Special Education Administrators, and the Vermont Association of School Business Officials. And the report works to keep you and the members of all of those associations informed about what's happening in the legislature. And oftentimes it will have links to the actual language of the bill, so you can click on that link and find language of bills when you're looking for it. And it has, like I said, a list of the a link to the list of the legislators so that you can contact them when you want to. Another thing that we do at the VSBA is we send out quicker pieces of information that are updates and action alerts, and those are usually quite timely, and the action alerts are letting you know that if you want to weigh in on a certain topic, that it will give you the names of some people to contact and let you know what the time frame is. We also include on our website any commentary and testimony that is being given at the legislature by the VSBA, and we can also help you connect with legislators and committees if you're wondering, if you know about a certain bill that is under consideration, but you're wondering which committee it's in or which legislator would be the best for you to speak with, we can help you with that information.
And while you are absolutely not required to let us know if you have been invited to testify in a specific committee, we love knowing when our members are being relied upon for information, and to the extent we can support you in your testimony. Oftentimes, as Sue said earlier, legislation changes sometimes on an hourly basis, but definitely on a daily basis once things start really cooking. And we could help you if you've been invited to testify. Make sure that you're tailoring your comments to the most current issues being under consideration. So I have sometimes seen really effective witnesses lose their impact because they spend the bulk of their testimony speaking to an issue that was resolved 3 days prior. So, we don't monitor testimony from our members, but we definitely want to support you in terms of making sure you have the most up-to-date information about what's happening in committees so that you can provide the most impactful testimony possible. And we also like to come and watch our members testify. So please do let us know if you've been invited to appear before a committee, or if you need some help making introductions with committees if you have an interest in testifying. Any questions?
We don't have any at this time, Nicole.
We don't have any at this time. I might give folks a couple minutes. So if you are looking on our website for these resources that Sue referenced, I believe they're under the public policy tab. Is that correct, Sue? On
Yes.
our website. So the banner at the top of the website, there's a public policy tab. Under there, you can find there's a testimony and commentaries page, and then there's the public policy page has links to archived versions of the legislative report and other links that Sue referred to. So that's where to find it on the website.
Okay,
we have a question.
Yes, we have a statement and a question. The statement comes from Dan MacArthur. It says, the pending Act 46 lawsuits are designed to give the legislature time to address some of the issues around Act 46. I hope the VSBA can work to assist the many, many school board members around the state whose districts are being fractured by this issue, and thanks to you all. And the question is from Jill. She says, can you go over the supervisor union board representation question again? The one about if you are a larger population with several smaller populations.
Yes.
One thing that just a basic piece of information I think everybody knows, but it might be helpful just to state it once more, is that if you are a district that operates a school, you get 3 members, and if you do not, then you get 1 member. So that's the starting point.
That's the starting point. And pre-Act 46, supervisory unions were largely comprised of town school districts. Now, some towns were larger than others, but by and large, you had a single town district who would send their representatives, either 3 or 1. Post-Act 46, to the extent there are still supervisory unions, and there are, if districts within those supervisory unions merged, but not all of them because they had different operating structures, etc., you have a situation where in some instances, towns or districts that used to send, we'll say, 12 representatives to the SU board, because they were used to be 4 individual districts, now have consolidated into a single district. They've gone from 12 representatives on the SU board to 3. And so they may have the same representation on the SU board as a single town school district that serves far fewer students. Vermont law allows for a supervisory union board to go to the state board and ask for a waiver to the statutory requirement for 3 members for each operating district. And in some instances, an agreement has been reached and they have gone to the state board and the state board has approved. In other instances, there's not been agreement. And so the members that serve the largest number of students but who don't have the majority on the SU board have no recourse under the law to appeal to the state board to review the SU board composition to assure that the configuration under the statutory requirements is fair and equitable. And so what we're in the process of doing is putting together, first of all, we're informing this is the process we usually undertake. We're informing our partners that this is a priority issue for us. We're seeking their input in terms of what do you think could work? And then I will take a recommendation to the VSBA board to consider either making as an association or making so that the association would bring the issue to a committee or work with the Agency of Education to assure that their slate of recommended statutory changes includes a solution that all folks think is fair and workable. So I hope that clarifies it. If not, send me an email or give me a phone call tomorrow. I'm happy to talk it through with you more.
Okay, I have one more question from Linda. Okay. Oh, there's another one just popped up. Do you have any sense what will be relevant to our new head of education?
Our new Secretary of Education?
Yes.
Well, he joined us for all of our regional meetings this fall and was fairly new on the job. But he talked about a need to or his interest in design strategies and a need to scale up effective governance models. But he has not been publicly clear about what that means, and the administration, other than what they put in the December 1st letter, has not been clear about what their priorities are for education in the upcoming session. The secretary did, at the last state board meeting, identify Act 166 changes as a priority of his. He indicated that he thought that it was one of the worst written pieces of legislation he's ever seen. And so, that's a signal that that's an issue he's interested in working on. But beyond that, I think the current area of focus is on doing some work within the Agency of Education, and we'll have to see what emerges either in the governor's State of the State address or the budget address in terms of legislative issues.
Okay, Nicole. Jill, who had the question about the SUs, she said, when will this potentially be done? Before 2019's merger?
In terms of the SU board composition, well, if the General Assembly takes action this session, which may or may not happen, then they get to determine the effective date. So I don't know. That's not something I can control. I think it'll depend on how early in the session a bill gets developed and approved by both bodies. If it's May, sometimes changes take effect July 1. but sometimes they'll take effect on passage. Sometimes they take effect, 6 months to a year down the road. So it really depends on what's in the bill and the nature of the issues. So I can't say for sure. I'd say the earliest it would take effect would be July 1, and what I'm envisioning would be that what would take effect would be the ability of an SU board or members of an SU board to seek a review by the state board of the composition. So it wouldn't be an automatic change to the SU board composition. It would be a path to review by the state board.
Jill said, thanks, just wondering if something was really moving already. Already moving.
No, nothing's moving. We don't even have committees yet. The VSBA is moving because this is our resolution. We're doing work internally to prepare for the session. But to my knowledge, committees don't even know about this.
Okay, Nicole, I think you've answered all the questions.
All right, and we are 4 minutes ahead of schedule. So let me just go back to the slide with our contact information. So many of you know how to reach us, but just in case you don't, there's our email address and phone number. Again, please feel free to reach out anytime you have a question. If you read the report and you're not clear about something, Sue's the best person to go to with that, although I'm always available to take questions or calls. During the legislative session, email is definitely the best way to reach us because we're out of the office so frequently, but we do our best to respond within 24 hours to email. So definitely be in touch. It's likely to be another dynamic year for public education, so stay engaged and informed, and make sure, as Sue said earlier, you're reaching out to legislators so that they turn to you when they have questions about bills impacting public education in your community. So thanks again for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening.